They thought humans were extinct. For 300 years, the galaxy celebrated in silence, believing the most dangerous species in known space had finally burned themselves out in their endless wars. The Galactic Council had even erected monuments to commemorate the Great Cleansing, the day humanity supposedly vanished from existence. But when the Void Swarm emerged from the dark between galaxies, devouring entire star systems and converting civilizations into writhing biomass, the truth became terrifyingly clear. Every species that had ever mocked human primitive aggression now faced a simple choice: call for help from the monsters they thought were dead, or watch the universe itself be consumed. The distress signal went out on every frequency, in every language, carrying one desperate message across the cosmos: we were wrong. Please come back. What they got in return wasn't forgiveness. It was something far more terrifying. Humanity had been waiting, watching, and preparing for this exact moment. And they had not been idle during their supposed extinction. The galaxy was about to learn why humans had once been called the devil's own children by every species that had ever encountered them. The only question remaining was whether there would be anything left to save when humanity was finished with their retaliation. Admiral Zextera of the Galactic Council fleet pressed his six-fingered hands against the curved viewing port of his flagship, watching in horror as another star system winked out of existence. The Kepler 442 system, home to 12 billion souls, simply ceased to be. No explosion, no dramatic flash of light. Just there one moment, gone the next, leaving behind a spreading darkness that seemed to devour even the light from neighboring stars. That's the 47th system in 6 cycles, reported his tactical officer, Lieutenant Yara. Her normally blue skin had taken on a sickly green pallor that marked extreme stress in her species. The Void Swarm is accelerating its consumption rate. Zextera's mandibles clicked in frustration. 3 months ago, his greatest concern had been mediating trade disputes between the Centauri Mining Consortium and the Vegan Agricultural Alliance. Now, he commanded what remained of the greatest military force in galactic history, and it was utterly useless against an enemy that consumed matter itself. The first reports had come from the Outer Rim, from exploratory vessels that had ventured too far into the dark spaces between galaxies. Ships returning with tales of massive, writhing entities that moved through the void like cosmic parasites, converting everything they touched into more of themselves. The Council had dismissed these reports as space madness, the psychological breakdown that sometimes affected crews on long-range missions. They stopped dismissing the reports when the Edge colonies simply vanished. The hegemony of Keth, proud descendants of apex predators from a high-gravity world, had sent their battle fleets to investigate. 12,000 ships, crewed by warriors who had never known defeat, armed with weapons that could crack planets. None returned. Long-range sensors detected only an expanding cloud of the same writhing biomass that the scouts had described. That was when the true scope of the threat became clear. The Void Swarm wasn't just consuming individual ships or planets. It was converting entire star systems into more of itself, growing stronger with every world it devoured. Worse, it seemed to learn from each encounter, adapting its tactics and growing more efficient with every victory. "Sir," called communications officer Tell from across the bridge, his tentacles dancing nervously over his console. "We're receiving another evacuation request from the Sigma Draconis cluster. They're saying the darkness is already visible in their outer system." Zextera's heart sank. The Sigma Draconis cluster contains 17 inhabited worlds with a combined population of over 50 billion. Even with every available transport in the fleet, they could evacuate perhaps 1% of that number before the swarm arrived. "Tell them," Zextera began, then stopped. What did he tell them? That they were sorry? That the Council had done everything possible? Both would be lies. The truth was that the combined military might of 300 civilizations was helpless against this threat. "Sir," Tell continued, his voice breaking slightly, "they're also asking if we've heard anything back from the transmission." The transmission. Zextera closed his eyes, trying not to think about the desperate decision the Council had made 2 weeks ago. In their most classified archives, buried beneath layers of encryption and shame, lay the location of 12 human worlds that had survived the supposed extinction of their species. Worlds that the Council had deliberately ignored, hoping that humanity would simply fade away into irrelevance. Humanity, the species that had once held the galaxy in terror through sheer, relentless aggression. The species that had turned warfare into an art form and practiced it with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. The species that every other civilization had united to drive to the edge of extinction, not because they were evil, but because they were too dangerous to be allowed to flourish. Council archives contain reports that still gave Zextra nightmares. Humans boarding enemy vessels through hull breaches, fighting in vacuum with jury-rigged breathing apparatus. Human commanders deliberately ramming their ships into enemy flagships, sacrificing themselves to create tactical opportunities. Human soldiers who would fight on with injuries that would kill most other species, powered by nothing but spite and refusal to surrender. The galaxy had been at peace for 3 centuries because humanity had been reduced to a handful of isolated worlds, quarantined and contained. Now that peace was ending, and the Council found itself in the impossible position of asking their former enemies for help. The transmission had been simple, a mathematical proof of galactic-level distress sent to every known human settlement, followed by star charts showing the swarm's current position and rate of advance. No apologies, no explanations, just a desperate plea for intervention from species that had once tried to wipe humanity from existence. Nothing yet, Tel, Zextra said finally. Continue monitoring all frequencies. But even as he spoke, he wondered if the humans were simply enjoying watching their former oppressors face extinction. It would be a perfectly human response. Patient, methodical revenge served after centuries of waiting. A new alert chimed across the bridge, and Lieutenant Yara's voice cut through the ambient noise with barely contained panic. Sir, we're detecting massive spatial distortions in the Arcturus sector. The swarm has accelerated its timeline. It's moving toward the core worlds. Zextra's blood ran cold. The core worlds included the council capital of New Centauri Prime, home to the galactic government, and nearly 200 billion souls. If the swarm reached the core systems, galactic civilization would collapse entirely. Time to arrival, he asked, though he dreaded the answer. At current rate of advance, 48 hours. 48 hours. Less than 2 standard days before the heart of galactic civilization was consumed by an unstoppable enemy. Zextra stared out at the stars, each one representing billions of lives that depended on decisions he was utterly unqualified to make. Sir, Tel's voice carried a strange note of confusion. I'm picking up something on the deep space monitoring array. It's not the swarm. What is it? Tel's tentacles moved across his console with increasing speed, his excitement building. Multiple contacts, moving at impossible speeds. They're coming from the direction of the old human territories. Zextra felt his heart skip. How many contacts? Sir, I can't get an accurate count. The signatures are unlike anything in our databases. They're not registering as individual ships. It's more like they're reading as single massive objects, but the energy signatures suggest. Tel paused, rechecking his readings. Sir, if these numbers are accurate, each contact is outputting more power than our entire fleet combined. The bridge fell silent except for the humming of electronics. Every officer stared at their stations, trying to process what they were hearing. In 3 centuries of peace, military technology had advanced steadily, but incrementally. Ship designs had become more efficient, weapons more precise, but the basic principles remained the same. What Tel was describing sounded impossible. Put on the main screen, Zextra ordered. The forward viewing port flickered and changed to display long-range sensor data. At first, there was nothing but the familiar star field, marked here and there with the ominous dark patches where the swarm had already passed. Then, at the edge of sensor range, new contacts began appearing. They weren't ships in any sense that galactic civilization would recognize. They were massive geometric structures, each 1 kilometer in length, moving through space with purposeful precision. As the sensors adjusted to track them, more appeared. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Mother of stars, whispered Yara. How many are there? Computer indicates over 10,000 individual contacts, Tel reported, his voice barely steady. Sir, these aren't showing up as separate vessels. The entire formation is moving as a single entity, but each component is larger than our biggest dreadnoughts. Zextaros stared at the display, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. 10,000 ships, each one massive enough to dwarf Council capital ships, moving in perfect coordination through interstellar space at speeds that should have been impossible. The humans hadn't just survived their supposed extinction. They had been building something. "Sir," communications officer Tell called out, his voice tight with tension. "We're receiving a transmission. It's on all frequencies, maximum broadcast strength. Origin, the lead human vessel." Zextaros straightened in his command chair. After 3 centuries of silence, humanity was finally answering. "Put it through." The speakers crackled with static, then cleared to reveal a human voice, calm, measured, and carrying an undertone of barely controlled rage. "This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Chun of the Terran Retribution Fleet. We received your distress signal." The voice paused, and in that pause, Zextara could hear the weight of 3 centuries of isolation and preparation. "We're coming." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in absolute silence. Outside the viewing port, the human fleet continued its approach, 10,000 impossible ships moving with deadly purpose toward an enemy that had consumed 47 star systems. Zextara found himself offering a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Not for victory, but that when this was over, there would still be a galaxy left to save. Behind them, the Void Swarm continued its inexorable advance toward the core worlds. Ahead of them, humanity's revenge fleet moved to intercept. And caught between them, the remnants of galactic civilization could only wait and hope that they had chosen the lesser of 2 evils. The war for the galaxy was about to begin, and everyone involved understood that regardless of who won, nothing would ever be the same again. Fleet Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the command deck of the TRS Inevitable Conclusion, watching the tactical display update with new intelligence about their target. 300 years of exile had given humanity time to perfect many things, but perhaps none more thoroughly than the art of planning revenge. The command deck itself would have been unrecognizable to the galactic species that had once driven humanity to the edge of extinction. Gone were the cramped, utilitarian designs of old human warships. The Inevitable Conclusions Command Center was a vast sphere, with the command crew positioned at various levels throughout the 3-dimensional space. Holographic displays floated freely, manipulated by gesture and thought through neural interfaces that had been perfected during the long years of isolation. "Admiral," called Commander Martinez from his position at the tactical station, located on what would have been the ceiling in traditional ship design. "Long-range reconnaissance drones have completed their survey of the Void Swarm. We have comprehensive analysis ready for review." Sarah nodded, her neural implant interfacing with the ship's systems to bring the data directly into her consciousness. What she saw confirmed their worst fears and best hopes simultaneously. The Void Swarm was indeed massive, a collection of biomechanical entities that had converted the matter from consumed star systems into an ever-growing fleet of hunter-killer organisms. Each component of the swarm was roughly the size of a small moon, covered in sensory organs and weapon systems that defied easy categorization. They moved through space like a school of cosmic predators, consuming everything in their path and converting it into more of themselves. The consumed matter wasn't just destroyed, it was transformed into something far worse. Detailed scans revealed that the swarm incorporated the genetic and technological information from every species it devoured, making it stronger and more adaptable with each victory. The proud warships of the Keithian hegemony could be seen embedded in the larger swarm entities, their hulls twisted into organic weapon systems. Worse, thermal imaging suggested that some of the consumed populations were still alive, integrated into the swarm's collective consciousness. "Estimated total mass?" Sarah asked. "Approximately 400,000 cubic kilometers of converted matter, spread across roughly 800 individual entities," Martinez replied. "Each entity appears to be independently capable of planetary consumption, but they operate with perfect coordination." Sarah absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally she felt the familiar cold fury that had sustained her through 3 centuries of preparation. The galaxy that had once tried to exterminate humanity was facing its own extinction, and they had turned to their former victims for salvation. The irony was not lost on her. Transmission from the Second Fleet. Announced Communications Officer Park. Admiral Reyes reports his forces are in position at the Tau Ceti Junction. Third and Fourth Fleets have completed their flanking maneuvers. Sarah smiled grimly. The human fleet that approached the swarm was only the tip of the spear. For 300 years, humanity had been building, preparing, and, most importantly, learning from their past mistakes. Never again would they allow themselves to be cornered by a hostile galaxy. The Terran Retribution fleet consisted of 4 separate fleets, each one larger than the combined military forces of the current galactic civilization. But, more than their size, it was their technology that would shock their former enemies. Humanity had spent 3 centuries advancing their military capabilities without the restraints of galactic peace treaties or ethical oversight committees. Admiral, called Dr. Kim from the research station, her voice carrying excitement despite the grim circumstances. Preliminary analysis of the swarm's biosignatures is complete. I think we understand how they operate. Sarah gestured for the data, and Dr. Kim's findings flooded into her consciousness through the neural link. The Void Swarm wasn't just a collection of individual entities. It was a single distributed organism, with each component serving as both an individual hunter and a node in a vast biological network. They shared information instantaneously across vast distances, allowing them to coordinate attacks and adapt to new threats with impossible speed. More disturbing was the discovery that the swarm learned not just from its victories, but from every encounter. The scattered reports from the few ships that had escaped swarm attacks weren't coincidences. They were deliberate. The swarm had allowed some vessels to escape so it could study the fleeing ship's capabilities and develop countermeasures. Fascinating, Sarah murmured. They're not just consuming civilizations, they're studying them. Each attack gives them more data about galactic military capabilities. Which means, Dr. Kim continued, they already know everything about current galactic military technology. Ship designs, weapon systems, defensive capabilities, they've observed and cataloged all of it. But they don't know anything about us, Sarah concluded. Exactly. We've been in isolation for 3 centuries. Our technology, our tactics, our capabilities, it's all completely unknown to them. Sarah's smile widened. Humanity's greatest weakness had become their greatest strength. The same isolation that had nearly driven them to extinction had also made them an unknown quantity to the galaxy's new enemy. Signal all fleet commanders, she ordered. Begin Operation Prometheus. Throughout the Terran Retribution fleet, ships began to change. What the galactic observers had mistaken for massive single vessels were revealed to be something far more complex. Each ship was actually a mobile construction platform carrying hundreds of smaller attack craft in various stages of assembly. But these weren't traditional fighters or bombers. 3 centuries of advancement had given humanity capabilities that bordered on science fiction. Swarm fabrication allowed ships to literally grow new components during combat, adapting to enemy tactics in real time. Quantum entanglement networks provided instantaneous communication across any distance. Most terrifying of all, humanity had weaponized their own psychological warfare capabilities, creating weapons designed not just to destroy, but to terrorize. The lead elements of the human fleet began to spread out, taking positions that would have seemed random to traditional military observers. But Sarah wasn't planning a traditional engagement. The Void Swarm had consumed 47 star systems by being unstoppable in direct combat. Humanity had no intention of fighting them directly. Admiral, Martinez called out, we're receiving a transmission from the Galactic Fleet. Admiral Zexthera is requesting a joint tactical conference. Sarah considered this. The Galactic Fleet was a collection of survivors and refugees barely capable of self-defense, let alone meaningful military action against the swarm. But they did represent the remaining institutional knowledge of galactic civilization. Accepted. Transfer him to my ready room. Sarah's ready room was a smaller sphere adjacent to the command deck, designed for private conferences and strategic planning. As the holographic projection of Admiral Zexthera materialized, she noted the exhaustion in his posture, the desperate hope in his compound eyes. Admiral Chun, Zextara began, his translator rendering his words in accented standard. I want to thank you for responding to our distress signal. I know our species have history. History, Sarah repeated, her voice flat. Is that what we're calling the systematic attempt to exterminate my people? Zextara's mandibles clicked in what Sarah recognized as embarrassment. I was not involved in those decisions. Most of my generation was born after the Isolation Accord was signed. But you benefited from it. Your entire civilization enjoyed 3 centuries of peace because my people were removed from the equation. Yes, Zextara admitted. We did. Sarah studied the alien admiral. There was no point in nursing old grievances when the galaxy itself hung in the balance. Revenge would come later, in forms that the galactic species couldn't yet imagine. What do you need from my fleet? She asked. Coordination. The Void Swarm operates as a single entity. If we could synchronize our attacks, create multiple pressure points— No, Sarah interrupted. Your fleet would be destroyed in the first engagement. The swarm has adapted to every known military technology in the galaxy. Your ships are obsolete before they engage. Zextara's posture stiffened. Then what do you propose? You evacuate. Get every civilian transport out of the combat zone. My fleet will handle the swarm. That's impossible. Even if you could match them ship for ship, which our analyses suggest you cannot, the swarm has numerical superiority. They've converted the matter from 47 star systems. Admiral, Sarah said quietly, you're thinking like the galaxy thinks. In terms of traditional fleet engagements, territorial control, acceptable casualties. We don't think that way anymore. She gestured, and the ready room's walls became transparent, showing the human fleet in all its terrifying glory. Thousands of ships hung in space, each one visibly growing and changing as automated systems constructed new components. We've had 300 years to ask ourselves a single question: what would it take to win a war against the entire galaxy? The Void Swarm is just another enemy, and we've been preparing to fight much worse. Zextara stared at the display, his compound eyes reflecting the lights of the human fleet. What are you planning? Sarah's smile was cold and predatory. We're going to teach the Void Swarm the same lesson the galaxy learned 3 centuries ago. Some enemies can't be defeated through conventional warfare. And what lesson is that? That humanity doesn't fight wars to win territory or achieve political goals. We fight wars to utterly destroy our enemies. And we've gotten very, very good at it. The transmission ended, leaving Sarah alone in her ready room. Outside, the human fleet continued its preparations, each ship a monument to 3 centuries of focused hatred and systematic preparation for revenge. The Void Swarm had made the same mistake that the galactic civilization had made 300 years ago. They had assumed that humans were just another species operating under the same rules and limitations as everyone else. They were about to learn why that assumption had nearly led to galactic extinction the first time around, and why the galaxy had been so desperate to remove humanity from the equation. But this time, there would be no isolation, no mercy, and no survivors. The first contact between humanity and the Void Swarm occurred 18 hours later in the empty space between Rigel and Betelgeuse, where the advanced elements of both forces finally met in what would later be remembered as the most asymmetric naval engagement in galactic history. Captain Elena Vasquez of the TRS Nightfall watched her tactical display with professional interest as the swarm scouts approached her position. 3 creatures, each the size of a small city, moved through space with organic grace that defied physics. Their surfaces rippled with bioluminescent patterns that serve as both communication and targeting systems, while tendrils hundreds of kilometers long extended from their bodies like cosmic fishing lines. Captain, reported her tactical officer, the entities are scanning us with energy patterns we've never encountered. They're definitely trying to catalog our capabilities. Elena smiled. Intelligence had predicted this exact scenario. The Void Swarm's greatest strength, its ability to adapt and learn from every encounter, was also its greatest weakness. They couldn't resist studying new opponents before destroying them. Let them look, she said. Make sure they get a good view. The Nightfall was a demonstration ship, one of several hundred vessels specifically designed to appear impressive while concealing humanity's true capabilities. To swarm sensors, it would register as a massive dreadnought carrying experimental weapons systems and defensive technologies that pushed the boundaries of known physics. In reality, it was an elaborate shell containing nothing but scanning equipment and a single pilot. The swarm entities moved closer, their bioluminescent patterns shifting to what Elena's computer identified as curious investigation. Tendrils extended toward the nightfall, preparing to physically examine this strange new vessel that had appeared from nowhere. All units, this is Nightfall, Elena broadcast on the tactical channel. Springtime in Prague. That innocuous phrase triggered the largest coordinated ambush in military history. The empty space around the Void swarm scouts suddenly erupted with human ships, vessels that had been hiding in sensor shadows, cloaked by technology that bent light and gravity around them, materialized in perfect attack formations. The swarm had been studying one ship while surrounded by an entire battle group. But these weren't the massive dreadnoughts that had approached openly. These were something far worse. Purpose-built hunter-killers designed specifically for close-quarters combat against biomechanical entities. Each ship was roughly the size of a traditional destroyer, but carried firepower equivalent to a fleet capital ship. The attack began with weapons that the galactic civilization had banned centuries ago as too inhumane for warfare between civilized species. Quantum destabilizers that unraveled the molecular bonds holding matter together. Temporal bombs that created localized time distortions, aging their targets to dust in seconds. Neural disruptors that turned biological nervous systems into conduits for pure agony. The first swarm entity died in less than 10 seconds, its massive form simply disintegrating as quantum destabilizers reduced it to component atoms. The second lasted longer, its adaptive defenses struggling to counter temporal weapons that attacked it across multiple time streams simultaneously. The third managed to send out a distress signal before neural disruptors overwhelmed its distributed consciousness, leaving it convulsing helplessly as its bioluminescent patterns flickered and died. Targets neutralized, Elena reported with satisfaction. 0 casualties, minimal ammunition expenditure. But the real purpose of the engagement wasn't to destroy 3 swarm scouts. It was to send a message to the massive intelligence that coordinated the entire swarm network. Through quantum-entangled communication links, the dying scouts transmitted their sensor data back to the main swarm fleet. For the first time since emerging from the dark between galaxies, the Void Swarm encountered something that not only resisted consumption, but destroyed its forces with casual efficiency. The response was immediate and massive. Admiral Sarah Chun watched from the command deck of the inevitable conclusion as long-range sensors detected the approaching swarm fleet. 800 entities, each one a converted star system's worth of matter, moving with coordinated purpose toward the human fleet's position. They're bringing everything, observed Commander Martinez. No reserves, no tactical caution. They want to overwhelm us with sheer mass. Sarah nodded. The swarm's tactics made perfect sense from their perspective. Every previous enemy had been defeated through overwhelming force applied with perfect coordination. They had no experience with opponents who actually wanted them to commit their entire force to a single engagement. Signal Admiral Reyes, she ordered. Begin Phase 2. 300 light-years away, Admiral Carlos Reyes received the signal aboard his flagship, the TRS Absolute Zero. His second fleet had spent the past week in careful preparation, using advanced manufacturing systems to construct what was arguably the most ambitious military engineering project in human history. All ships report ready, his tactical officer announced. The Stellar Demolition Array is charged and targeted. Reyes looked out at the local star, a yellow dwarf similar to humanity's original sun. In a few minutes, that star would cease to exist, and its destruction would announce to the galaxy that humanity had moved far beyond conventional warfare. Fire, he ordered simply. The Stellar Demolition Array was the culmination of 3 centuries of research into weaponizing stellar mechanics. Hundreds of ships fired simultaneously, their combined energy output directed not at the star itself, but at the quantum vacuum surrounding it. The effect was to create a cascading collapse of space-time that turned the star inside out, transforming it from a stable fusion reactor into an expanding sphere of high-energy plasma. The star died in silence, as all things do in the vacuum of space, but its death scream echoed across the galaxy as gravitational waves and exotic radiation spread outward at light speed. Every astronomical observatory in known space recorded the event, the deliberate murder of a star by artificial means. Within hours, the implications became clear. If humans could destroy stars, they could destroy anything. Planets, fleets, entire civilizations. All were equally vulnerable to weapons that operated on stellar scales. But the star's death served a purpose beyond psychological warfare. The expanding plasma cloud, carefully shaped by gravitational lenses, was directed toward the approaching Void Swarm fleet. The swarm entities detected the approaching energy wave and attempted evasive maneuvers, but their massive size worked against them. The stellar plasma, moving at a significant fraction of light speed and carrying the energy output of an entire star, struck the swarm fleet with the force of a cosmic tsunami. The first 100 entities simply vaporized, their biomechanical structures unable to withstand direct exposure to stellar core temperatures. The next wave tried to absorb the energy, their adaptive systems working frantically to process the incoming radiation. Some succeeded, growing larger and more powerful as they converted the plasma into additional mass. But success proved more dangerous than failure. The entities that absorbed stellar energy began to glow with their own internal fusion reactions, becoming unstable fusion bombs that detonated one by one throughout the swarm fleet. Each explosion triggered secondary reactions in neighboring entities, creating a chain reaction that tore through the previously coordinated formation. Within an hour, the 800-strong swarm fleet had been reduced to fewer than 200 surviving entities, scattered and confused, their communication networks disrupted by electromagnetic interference from the continuing stellar explosion. Phase 3, Sarah ordered. This was when the surviving galactic observers, monitoring the battle from a safe distance, finally understood what they were witnessing. Humanity hadn't just survived 3 centuries of exile. They had used that time to transform warfare itself into something that transcended traditional military doctrine. Phase 3 began with the deployment of what human tactical manuals classified as evolutionary warfare systems. Instead of sending ships to fight the surviving swarm entities, humanity deployed self-replicating weapons that adapted and evolved in real time. Millions of microscopic machines, each one a fusion of nanotechnology and artificial intelligence, were released into the battle zone. These machines were designed with one simple directive: consume swarm biomass and replicate into more effective versions of themselves. The effect was horrifying to observe. The microscopic machines swarmed over the surviving swarm entities like a plague, literally eating them from the inside out while simultaneously learning how to consume them more efficiently. Each generation of machines was more effective than the last, evolving at digital speeds to counter swarm defensive measures. The Void Swarm, for the first time since its emergence, found itself on the receiving end of consumption-based warfare. Entities that had devoured entire civilizations were reduced to screaming biomechanical shells as trillions of microscopic predators consumed them cell by cell. But even this wasn't the end of human preparations. Admiral, reported Dr. Kim from the research station, were detecting massive quantum fluctuations in the swarm entities. They're attempting to retreat to whatever dimension they originated from. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Intelligence had predicted this possibility. The Void Swarm's ability to travel between dimensions was probably how they had reached this galaxy in the first place. If they escaped, they could return later with new adaptations and reinforcements. Deploy the dimensional anchors, she ordered. Space around the surviving swarm entities suddenly became rigid as humanity's most advanced technology activated. Quantum generators created a locked space-time matrix that prevented dimensional travel, trapping the swarm entities in normal space, where they could be systematically destroyed. The last few dozen entities fought with desperate fury, unleashing weapons that turned space itself into a combat zone. Reality warped around their attacks, creating gravity wells and exotic matter storms that would have destroyed any conventional fleet. But humanity had planned for this too. The final phase of the engagement involved weapons that existed more as mathematical concepts than physical objects. probability bombs that altered the likelihood of swarm weapons functioning correctly. Causality missiles that struck their targets before being fired. Information weapons that attacked the basic logical structures underlying swarm consciousness. When the battle ended 6 hours after it began, nothing remained of the Void Swarm except microscopic debris and fading radiation signatures. 800 entities that had consumed 47 star systems had been utterly annihilated without inflicting a single casualty on the human fleet. The galactic observers, monitoring from their safe distance, recorded everything in stunned silence. Humanity hadn't just defeated the Void Swarm. They had made it look effortless, using weapons and tactics that bordered on incomprehensible. But Sarah Chun wasn't celebrating victory. She was thinking about the implications of what they had just demonstrated to the galaxy that had once tried to exterminate her species. The Void Swarm had been merely the opening act. The real show was just beginning. In the aftermath of the swarm's destruction, an eerie quiet settled over the galaxy. For the first time in months, long-range sensors detected no advancing darkness, no systems winking out of existence, no expanding clouds of converted matter. The threat that had terrorized 300 civilizations was simply gone, leaving behind only microscopic debris and the slowly cooling plasma of a murdered star. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a galaxy holding its breath, waiting to see what humanity would do next. Admiral Zexthera stood in the observation deck of his flagship, staring out at the human fleet with a mixture of awe and terror. The massive vessels hung in space like geometric monuments to applied violence, their surfaces crawling with automated systems that continued to build new weapons even in the aftermath of victory. "Sir," called his communications officer, "we're receiving a transmission from Admiral Chun. She's requesting a meeting aboard our flagship." Zexthera felt his heart skip. A human admiral wanted to board a galactic vessel. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "Accepted," he said, though every instinct screamed at him to refuse. 20 minutes later, Admiral Sarah Chun materialized in the flagship's main hangar bay, arriving via a transportation method that Zexthera's science officers couldn't even begin to explain. One moment the bay was empty. The next she was there, accompanied by 2 human officers whose mere presence seemed to distort the air around them. She was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder, but there was something about her that commanded immediate attention. Her uniform was simple black material that seemed to absorb light, and her eyes held the cold patience of someone who had spent centuries planning revenge. "Admiral Zexthera," she said as she approached, her voice carrying easily across the hangar bay. "I believe we have things to discuss." The formal meeting took place in the flagship's main conference room, with senior officers from both fleets present via holographic projection. Representatives from every major galactic civilization had been invited to witness what would become known as the New Geneva Convention. "The Void Swarm has been eliminated," Sarah began without preamble. "The immediate threat to galactic civilization is over." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the assembled delegates, but Sarah's next words cut it short. "However, this leaves us with a more complex problem. For 3 centuries, the galaxy has enjoyed peace specifically because my people were not part of the equation. Now we're back, and certain adjustments will need to be made." Council Speaker Vorth, speaking from the capital world of New Centauri Prime, leaned forward in his holographic projection. "Admiral Chun, we are grateful beyond words for humanity's intervention. The Council is prepared to discuss reparations, trade agreements, territorial concessions." "You misunderstand," Sarah interrupted smoothly. "I'm not here to negotiate humanity's return to the galactic community. I'm here to explain how that community will function now that we've returned." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Admiral Zexthera found himself gripping the edge of the conference table as the full implications of Sarah's words sank in. "You can't be serious," protested Ambassador Kethvar of the Regelian Confederacy. "You're talking about conquest. The galaxy will never. The galaxy already has," Sarah said calmly. She gestured, and holographic displays materialized around the conference table, showing current fleet positions throughout known space. "While we were dealing with the swarm, our other fleets took control of every major hyperspace junction, every communication relay, and every industrial center in galactic civilization. The displays showed a galaxy-spanning web of human naval forces positioned with surgical precision to control all strategic assets. Thousands of ships, each one more advanced than anything in the galactic arsenal, had moved into position while everyone's attention was focused on the dramatic battle against the Void Swarm. "This is impossible," whispered Science Counselor Drix. "Our sensors would have detected such massive fleet movements." "Your sensors detected what we wanted them to detect," Sarah replied. "Stealth technology was one of the first things we perfected during our exile. We've been watching you, learning your capabilities, cataloging your weaknesses for 300 years." She stood and walked to the main display, which now showed a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with human fleet positions marked in red. It was a masterpiece of strategic positioning. Every major civilization was surrounded, cut off from their allies, unable to coordinate any meaningful resistance. The question now is whether this transition happens peacefully or violently. The choice is yours. Admiral Zextharov found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" Sarah turned back to the conference table, her expression unreadable. "Justice. For 3 centuries, the galaxy has enjoyed peace and prosperity built on the attempted genocide of my species. That debt needs to be acknowledged and paid. We're not responsible for the decisions of our ancestors," protested Ambassador Kethvar. "Aren't you?" Sarah's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "Your entire civilization exists because ours was nearly exterminated. Every ship in your navy, every trade route in your space, every colony world in your territory exists because humanity was removed from the equation. You've all benefited from our near extinction." She gestured again, and new displays appeared showing economic data, trade statistics, and population growth charts spanning 3 centuries. Galactic GDP increased by 340% in the 50 years after humanity's exile. Interstellar trade volume increased by 500%. Colonial expansion accelerated by 600%. The galaxy quite literally prospered from our absence. The numbers were undeniable. Every civilization present had experienced unprecedented growth and expansion in the centuries since humanity's enforced isolation. The galactic economy had boomed precisely because the most militarily aggressive species had been removed from competition. "So what happens now?" asked Council Speaker Vorth. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since entering the conference room, she looked genuinely pleased. "Now you get to experience the galaxy the way it was before you exiled us. Competitive, dangerous, uncertain." She returned to her seat and activated a new holographic display that showed what appeared to be a treaty document. "These are the terms for humanity's return to galactic civilization. First, formal acknowledgement of the attempted genocide perpetrated against our species, including full historical records and public memorials on every core world. Second, reparations totaling approximately 1/3 of the economic growth achieved during our absence. This will be paid over the next century through resource transfers, technology sharing, and industrial capacity allocation. Third, restructuring of the Galactic Council to include mandatory human representation at all levels of government, with veto power over any decisions that might affect human interests. Fourth, demilitarization of all galactic naval forces to pre-isolation war levels, with human observers assigned to monitor compliance." The conference room erupted in shocked protest from the assembled delegates. The terms weren't just demanding. They would fundamentally reshape galactic civilization, reducing every other species to junior partners in their own government. "These terms are completely unacceptable," declared Ambassador Kethvar. "The Regellian Confederacy will never agree to such humiliation." Sarah's smile widened. "I was hoping someone would say that." She gestured, and the holographic display changed to show real-time sensor feeds from the Regellian home system. Human ships were moving into orbit around Rigel Prime, their weapons trained on the planet's surface. As of 30 minutes ago, every major population center in Regellian space is within range of our orbital bombardment systems. Your choice is to agree to our terms or to explain to your people why their cities are being reduced to radioactive craters. The casual manner in which she delivered the threat made it infinitely more terrifying. This wasn't the rage of a conqueror or the desperation of a cornered enemy. This was the cold calculation of someone who had spent 3 centuries planning exactly this moment. "You're talking about holding the entire galaxy hostage," protested Council Speaker Vorth. "I'm talking about collecting a debt," Sarah corrected. 300 years ago, the galaxy decided that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to exist as equals. You were right, by the way. We are too dangerous. But the solution isn't to exile us. The solution is to make sure we never have reason to consider you enemies. She stood again, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. "You have 48 hours to consider our terms. After that, we begin implementing them with or without your cooperation. And, I should mention, the fleet you observed destroying the Void Swarm represents approximately 5% of our total military capacity. We have many more ships, carrying much more advanced weapons, positioned throughout the galaxy. If we refuse," asked Admiral Zextara, though he dreaded the answer, "then you'll discover what we spent 300 years building in preparation for a war against the entire galaxy. The Void Swarm was merely a convenient field test for our latest generation of weapons. The real demonstration of our capabilities would be considerably more comprehensive." The meeting ended with humanity's demands hanging over the galaxy like a sword. As Sarah Chun and her officers vanished as mysteriously as they had arrived, the assembled delegates were left to contemplate an impossible choice: accept subjugation to their former victims, or face the full wrath of a species that had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of warfare. But for Sarah Chun, walking through the corridors of her flagship hours later, this was just the beginning. The galaxy had asked for humanity's help against the Void Swarm, and they had provided it. Now it was time to collect payment for 3 centuries of exile, humiliation, and attempted genocide. The galaxy had wanted peace without humanity. Now they would learn what humanity was like when peace was no longer possible. And deep in the classified archives of the Terran Retribution Fleet, construction orders were already being issued for weapon systems that would make the destruction of the Void Swarm look like a minor skirmish. Because Sarah Chun understood something that the galaxy was only beginning to comprehend. This wasn't the end of humanity's revenge. This was just the beginning. 47 hours and 36 minutes after humanity's ultimatum, the galaxy's answer came not through diplomatic channels, but through the sudden appearance of the largest military coalition in galactic history. Admiral Zextara watched from his flagship as nearly 10,000 vessels from 67 different species converged on the human fleet's position. The coalition of free worlds, hastily assembled in the wake of humanity's demands, represented the combined military might of every civilization that refused to accept subjugation to their former victims. "They're really going to do it," whispered his tactical officer. "They're going to fight the humans." Zextara felt a mixture of pride and terror as he watched the massive coalition fleet take formation. Pride in the galaxy's refusal to bow to human tyranny. Terror at what would happen when that refusal met humanity's response. The coalition had been organized by the Regelian Confederacy and the Centauri Alliance, with support from dozens of smaller powers who preferred war to surrender. Their strategy was simple: use overwhelming numbers to crush the human fleet before it could deploy the exotic weapons that had destroyed the Void Swarm. It was a plan born of desperation and hope in equal measure. Hope that humanity's demonstrated capabilities were somehow limited or exhaustible. Desperation because the alternative was accepting permanent subjugation to a species they had tried to exterminate. Admiral Sarah Chun received news of the coalition's formation while reviewing construction reports in her ready room aboard the inevitable conclusion. The latest batch of manufacturing requests included orders for weapon systems so advanced that their theoretical descriptions read like science fiction. "Admiral," reported Commander Martinez, "long-range sensors are detecting a massive fleet convergence at the Altair system. Coalition forces from across the galaxy are forming up for what appears to be a coordinated assault." Sarah nodded without looking up from her reports. Intelligence had predicted this response with over 90% certainty. The galaxy would try one last desperate gamble before accepting the new reality of human dominance. Estimated strength? Approximately 10,000 vessels, representing most of the galaxy's remaining military capacity. They're using the Altair system as a staging area, probably planning to advance on our position within the next 12 hours. Sarah finally looked up, her expression thoughtful. 10,000 ships. That's actually more than our estimates suggested they could assemble. Orders, Admiral. Sarah stood and walked to the viewing port, looking out at her own fleet. 3,000 vessels hung in space around the inevitable conclusion, each one a testament to 3 centuries of focused military development. But they were merely the advance force, the tip of a spear that extended far beyond what any galactic observer had imagined possible. Signal Admiral Reyes, Admiral Morrison, and Admiral Park, she ordered. Operation Galactic Dawn is authorized. Martinez's face went pale. Operation Galactic Dawn was the final contingency plan, designed for use only if the galaxy chose total war over negotiated surrender. It represented the complete unleashing of humanity's military capabilities, with no restraint or limitation on the weapons employed. Admiral, are you certain? Once we implement Galactic Dawn, there's no returning to the current status quo. The galaxy made their choice, Sarah replied calmly. They prefer war to peace. We'll give them war. 3 hours later, the Coalition fleet at Altair detected the first signs that something was terribly wrong. Long-range sensors began registering impossible readings from seemingly empty space. Massive energy signatures appearing and disappearing, gravitational anomalies that suggested objects the size of small moons moving at near-light speed. Admiral Kethvar of the Regelian Confederacy, commanding the Coalition fleet from his flagship storm of Righteous Fury, watched the sensor displays with growing unease. The readings made no sense according to known physics. What are we looking at? He demanded of his science officer. Unknown, sir. The signatures are consistent with massive objects moving through hyperspace, but the energy outputs suggest impossible acceleration rates. If these readings are accurate, some of these objects are outputting more power than small stars. Before Kethvar could respond, space around the Altair system began to change. The first sign was a subtle dimming of background starlight, as if something vast was casting shadows across interstellar distances. Then came the gravitational waves, pulses of distorted spacetime that made navigation computers across the Coalition fleet scream warnings about impossible stellar configurations. Finally, they materialized. The human reserve fleets emerged from hyperspace with the precision of a perfectly choreographed dance. Thousands upon thousands of vessels, each one larger and more advanced than anything in the Coalition's arsenal, appeared in perfect formation around the Altair system. But these weren't the geometric constructs that had engaged the Void Swarm. These were weapons platforms that defied easy categorization. Some were clearly ships in the traditional sense, while others appeared to be artificial structures that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that hurt to look at directly. Mother of Stars, whispered Admiral Kethvar, as the scope of humanity's hidden fleet became apparent. How many ships do they have? His tactical officer was frantically trying to process the incoming data. Computer indicates over 200,000 individual contacts, but, sir, some of these objects are registering as single vessels while occupying volumes equivalent to small planets. I don't think our classification systems can handle whatever we're looking at. The Coalition fleet found itself utterly surrounded, outnumbered by a ratio of 20-1 by opponents using technology that appeared to be generations ahead of anything in their arsenal. But even more terrifying than the numbers was the realization that humanity had been holding back during their engagement with the Void Swarm. The exotic weapons that had seemed so devastating against the Swarm were apparently considered basic equipment in the human arsenal. What surrounded the Coalition fleet now represented capabilities that bordered on incomprehensible. Admiral Sarachin's voice cut through the tactical frequencies on an open channel, broadcast to every ship in the Coalition fleet. This is Fleet Admiral Chun of the Terran Retribution Force. You have assembled here to contest humanity's return to galactic civilization. Before this engagement begins, I want to make sure you understand what you're choosing. The transmission included sensor data that revealed the true scope of the human fleet. Not just the vessels surrounding Altair, but similar formations positioned around every major star system in the galaxy. The logistical achievement was staggering. Humanity had secretly deployed more military assets than the rest of the galaxy combined, positioning them with surgical precision to control all strategic locations. 300 years ago, you decided that humanity was too dangerous to coexist with galactic civilization. You were correct. We are too dangerous. But the solution was never to exile us. It was to ensure we never had reason to consider you enemies. Sarah's voice carried across space with implacable calm, as if she were discussing weather rather than the fate of galactic civilization. You sent a distress signal asking for our help. We provided it. In return, we offered you terms for humanity's peaceful reintegration into galactic society. You chose war instead. The transmission paused, and in that silence, every being in the Coalition fleet understood that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. This is your final opportunity to reconsider. Stand down your fleets, accept our terms, and this ends with galactic civilization intact. Continue this course, and you will discover what we built during 3 centuries of exile. Admiral Kethvar stared at the tactical display, watching human vessels that could destroy his entire fleet without sustaining meaningful casualties. But pride and desperation drove him to a decision that would haunt galactic history. All ships, he broadcast to the Coalition fleet, remember why we're here. We fight for the freedom of every species in the galaxy. We will not bow to human tyranny. The Coalition fleet opened fire with everything they had. 10,000 ships unleashed their most powerful weapons in a coordinated barrage designed to overwhelm even the most advanced defenses. Plasma beams that could melt continents, particle cannons that could crack moons, and exotic weapons borrowed from the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. The human response was immediate and absolute. What happened next would be studied by military historians for thousands of years, though the records would be classified at the highest levels to prevent the complete demoralization of galactic civilization. The first wave of human retaliation involved weapons that attacked the fundamental forces holding matter together. Entire Coalition ships simply ceased to exist, their atomic structure unraveled by forces that treated nuclear binding energy as a minor inconvenience. The second wave used temporal weapons that aged attacking vessels into dust while simultaneously striking them in the past, creating causality loops that erased them from the timeline entirely. The third wave deployed probability bombs that altered the mathematical likelihood of Coalition weapons functioning correctly. Fusion reactors that should have operated reliably for centuries suddenly experienced catastrophic failures. Weapon systems that had been tested thousands of times mysteriously malfunctioned at critical moments. But the fourth wave was what broke the Coalition's will to fight. Humanity deployed consciousness weapons, devices that attacked not ships or bodies, but minds themselves. Coalition crews found themselves experiencing the memories and emotions of every human who had died during the attempted genocide 3 centuries ago. They felt the despair of exile, the rage of betrayal, the cold fury of 300 years spent planning revenge. Within 30 minutes, the Coalition fleet had been reduced to scattered debris and surrendering vessels. 10,000 ships, representing the combined military might of the galaxy, had been utterly destroyed by an enemy that hadn't sustained a single casualty. But Admiral Sarah Chun wasn't finished. "Open a channel to every inhabited system in the galaxy," she ordered. Her image appeared on communication screens across known space, from the smallest frontier outpost to the grandest capital worlds. Every being capable of receiving transmissions found themselves looking at the face of humanity's revenge. "Citizens of the galaxy," she began, her voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of preparation. "Your governments chose war over peace. Your military forces chose pride over wisdom. This is the result." The transmission included sensor feeds from the battle at Altair, showing the casual ease with which humanity had annihilated the galaxy's last hope of military resistance. But this demonstration was not conducted out of cruelty. It was conducted to prevent a much larger tragedy. You now understand what humanity is capable of when we choose violence over diplomacy. Sarah paused, letting the implications sink in across billions of watching minds. Our terms remain unchanged. Formal acknowledgement of past crimes, reparations for 3 centuries of exile, restructured governance with human oversight, and demilitarization of galactic military forces. These terms are non-negotiable. However, she continued, and her tone shifted slightly, "We are not conquerors. We are survivors seeking justice. Accept our terms, and humanity will take its rightful place as partners in galactic civilization. Continue to resist, and you will discover that what you witnessed today was merely a demonstration of our restraint. The transmission ended, leaving the galaxy in stunned silence. Within hours, surrender documents began arriving from every major government. The Retaliated Confederacy, the Centauri Alliance, the Kepler Federation. One by one, every civilization that had participated in humanity's exile 3 centuries ago formally accepted the terms of the New Geneva Convention. But for Admiral Sarah Chun, standing on the command deck of the inevitable conclusion as reports of galactic surrender flooded in, this wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound sadness for what could have been. Humanity had returned to the galaxy, not as partners or allies, but as conquerors whose mercy depended entirely on their former enemies' willingness to acknowledge past crimes. The species that had once dreamed of exploring the stars alongside other civilizations now stood alone at the apex of galactic power, surrounded by subjects rather than friends. The galaxy had sent a distress signal, and humanity had answered. But the price of that answer was the death of any hope for the peaceful coexistence that both species had once imagined possible. In the end, the galaxy got exactly what they had feared 300 years ago, a universe where humanity's technological and military superiority made resistance futile and submission inevitable. The only difference was that this time, there would be no exile, no mercy, and no second chances. Humanity was home, and they intended to stay.